Hello and welcome to number 19 in this Child Studies Presses series on Chinese Australian history. Today we're talking about the dictation test, or more particularly we're talking about the history and background that led up to Australia's dictation test, which was of course a foundation to immigration restriction for the first 50 years of federation. I cover most of this in my book on Australia's dictation test, the test it was a crime to fail. But this particular one comes from an article that I wrote for the Journal of the Royal Australian Historical Society in 2020 called Avoid Stigmatising Them by Name. And so it covers some of the material in the book, of course, but it covers mostly the background history of discrimination against Chinese people in particular, or non-white people in general, and how the dictation test evolved from a range of things, from the TAL test to the education test to what became known as the dictation test. And I hope, as usual, how bots discuss this in some detail, and I hope that you will enjoy listening.
Imagine stepping up to take a test, but not because you need to prove you're smart or anything. No, this test, the whole system, it's deliberately, completely rigged for you to fail.
Right. Not subtly rigged either. Overtly. Every element designed to trip you up, to stop you.
Exactly. And this isn't some, abstract idea. We're talking about a real legal instrument. It was once a cornerstone of Australian national policy. And it was so unique, so absurd, really, in its true nature.
That people often just didn't get it. They thought, oh, this is just a really hard exam. Or maybe the examiner's being unfair today.
Yeah, but it was so much more insidious than that. Today we're doing a deep dive into an article by Michael Williams called Avoid Stigmatizing Them by Name. And wow, this piece really peels back the layers of history. It exposes the intricate, often, let's be honest, deeply hypocritical origins of what became known simply as the dictation test. For over 50 years, this seemingly harmless educational assessment, it served as the main, though unspoken, gatekeeper for Australian immigration. It shaped the very fabric of the new nation.
It really did.
It's a journey into how a country tried to define itself, not by who it welcomed in, but by who it meticulously, systematically kept out.
And our mission today, really, is to pull back that curtain.
Yeah.
To unpack the layers, the political maneuvering, the deep-seated racial prejudice, the economic anxieties that were just simmering away.
All coming together.
All coming together to create what the source material quite rightly calls gross chicanery. It's fascinating how perfectly engineered it was. A potential immigrant is set up to fail. And failure didn't just mean, sorry, try again later. No, it led straight to criminal charges, detention, and often pretty swift deportation. We're going to explore how this seemingly neutral educational test became the central tool for a highly discriminatory policy, a policy that cleverly avoided mentioning race.
But achieved its aims anyway.
With devastating effectiveness. You'll find out about the surprising international influences, the internal contradictions, the diplomatic tightrope walks, all shaping early Australia, all connected to this pretty extraordinary and often misunderstood piece of law.
So get ready to maybe challenge some assumptions you might have about how nations build their identities. We'll uncover some surprising facts and hopefully gain a deeper understanding of the roots of policies that, still echo today in how societies see, regulate, and sometimes restrict entry. To really grasp the dictation test, though, we need to start earlier. We need to look at the seeds of exclusion planted long before Australia even became a nation in 1901. Okay, let's unpack this.
The foundations of exclusion, early colonial efforts, and the white Australia ideal.
So before 1901, before Australia officially federated, became one nation, the individual colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, they were already busy. They were deeply entrenched in trying to pass racially motivated laws aimed at stopping certain people from entering.
Right. This wasn't something that just sprang up after Federation. It had been building. It was an evolution of sentiment stretching right back through the 19th century, reflecting some pretty deeply held and often exclusionary views.
And what's really striking about this early time is that even then, some people saw the absurdity of it all. There was a South Australian newspaper way back in 1896. Yeah. And it said basically the whole idea of an Australian colony introducing legislation to keep the colored man out of Australia is as absurd as it is unique, considering that the Aboriginal inhabitants are black.
Wow. That's quite pointed, acknowledging Indigenous Australians and the irony.
Exactly. A rare moment of acknowledging that uncomfortable truth. But despite that, this unique absurdity, as they called it, that was precisely the goal for most colonial policymakers.
And that tension you mentioned, that drive to consciously build a white Australia,
Mhm.
often by, well, ignoring or erasing the indigenous population already
Right.
there, that's what ultimately led to the Dictation Test.
Mm-hmm.
It was designed to achieve racial exclusion without ever saying race in the law. As you said, a bogus quiz, a meticulously crafted legal tool where the person taking it wasn't just expected to fail, they were designed to fail.
Flat up.
Completely set up. And the consequences were severe. Criminal charges, detention, deportation. It wasn't about education, it was about exclusion, just cleverly disguised.
So how did this specific thing, the dictation test, actually come about? It's not just the 1901 debates, is it?
Oh, no, not at all. You have to trace it back much further. It's a complex path through imperial conferences in London, back to colonial Chinese restriction acts from decades before.
Like the gold rush era.
Exactly. Infamous Goldfields riots like Lambing Flat. Even, you could argue, further back into the convict era, with all those struggles over defining free versus unfree labor. It connects to global influences, internal anxieties.
Global influences, like what?
Well, we see definite echoes of what was happening in the U.S. after slavery. Attempts to disenfranchise African Americans using things like literacy tests or poll taxes, seemingly neutral tools, but used to strip voting rights from specific groups.
Right. Literacy tests.
And you see similar things happening across the white settler world. Canada, South Africa, all grappling with who belonged. Plus, you have the British imperialists trying to keep this idea of one big happy empire going.
While allowing discriminatory policies in the colonies.
Precisely. The bedrock of why Australia adopted such a deliberately fake test for its white Australia policy really lies in this white settler mentality. Though back then they might have just said British or Christian, or maybe just white.
But British and Christian were tricky terms in Australia.
Yeah, they were problematic. You had lots of Irish people who definitely didn't identify as British, and their Catholicism was often viewed with suspicion by the dominant Protestant groups, sometimes seen as not quite Christian enough.
So white was easier.
White became a useful, if vague, cover-all term. It helped unify different colonial groups against whoever they saw as other, created a sense of shared identity, even if it papered over internal differences.
And the efforts to restrict Chinese people and later other non-white groups, that was central to pushing for federation itself.
Absolutely critical, both in prompting federation and shaping its early laws. It was so central, there was even this political joke. General Edwards in Hong Kong apparently asked Henry Parkes, the father of federation in 1890.
Yeah.
He asked if a visit from the Chinese fleet would not help your federation, just subtly hinting that this shared fear of Chinese influence was a powerful unifying force for the colonies.
Wow. Okay.
Exactly. And the debate over Chinese workers, mixing race and labor issues, you can see traces of that as early as 1830, way before the main indentured laborers arrived in the 1840s.
Because it started early.
It did. But it was the gold rushes in the 1850s and 60s with the big influx of Chinese miners that really brought it to a head. That's when the first Chinese restriction laws set the legislative precedents. These early efforts were just the start, though. Renewed restrictions in the 1880s set the stage for the imperial and intercolonial conferences that eventually led to the Natal Compromise.
Which led to the dictation test.
Exactly. A crucial, if pretty cynical, step. And this whole process, from the 1830s right through to federation, it's happening against the backdrop of this fundamental fight between labor wanting high wages and capital wanting cheap labor.
Right.
And alongside that, this growing fierce sense among the colonies that Australia was meant to be for the white man, preferably British.
And this boils down to labor versus capital, basically. White workers wanting high wages, employers wanting cheap labor, and Chinese workers got labeled cheap.
And worse, often unfree. That label unfree was incredibly loaded in Australia, still reeling from the convict era. The dignity of being a free worker was paramount, something to defend.
So calling Chinese labor unfree was a way to justify excluding them.
Pretty much.
Oh.
Treat them as a lesser class of worker. It's interesting, the historical record shows the early indentured laborers from Amoy between 1848 and 1853 were actually quite few, under 4,000.
Not a huge number.
No. But it was enough to start labeling all Chinese people as coolies. That derogatory term implying they were all just indentured labor stuck for decades.
Yeah.
Even though after the 1850s, those specific Amoy laborers stopped coming.
So later arrivals weren't indentured.
Mostly not. For the next century, Chinese immigrants mainly came from Cantonese-speaking areas via the credit ticket system. This was different, more like family or local debt arrangements, not coercive contracts. They were often free, or free after working off their passage costs relatively quickly.
But it looks similar enough to cause worry.
Exactly. The financial obligations seemed similar enough to worry those concerned about wage levels, especially on the competitive goldfields.
Yeah.
There was this rare European observer, J. Dundas Crawford, sent from China to report.
Yeah.
He actually understood the difference. He noted that if they have a too irksome bond, they soon clear themselves by honest labor.
Yeah.
But that kind of nuanced understanding, incredibly rare, mostly ignored by policymakers.
So basically, cultural unfamiliarity made it easy for those who wanted to see Chinese people, Chinamen, Celestials, as inherently different, as unfair rivals, as people who just didn't belong.
Absolutely. Differences in language, dress, food, customs, religion, all used to create division. Calling them coolies or unfree was a key way of othering them, separating them from the idealized white identity.
And that paved the way for discrimination.
Made it much easier to justify with less public pushback. But it's important to remember, Chinese people weren't the only group seen as undesirable.
Right.
They were just the most numerous and persistent group trying to enter. All the colonies worried about who was arriving. South Australia even petitioned London to restrict Irish entry.
Seriously. Because they were Catholic.
Largely, yes, and seen as anti-British. And Victoria even restricted people coming from Tasmania.
Get out, Tasmanian.
Yep. It shows the colonies had this strong, if fuzzy, idea of who was desirable. Definitely not Catholics, not convicts. And very early on, Chinese just didn't fit for all sorts of overlapping reasons.
So the hostility towards Chinese people was fueled by many arguments all at once.
All swirled together. The coolie versus free labor thing, hostility to non-Christians, aversion to different languages or customs. Then there was the sojourner versus settler idea, arguing Chinese people only came temporarily, so didn't deserve equal rights or land or to bring families.
But didn't they also fear Chinese men marrying white women? That contradicts the sojourner idea.
Exactly. Deeply revealing, isn't it? Many arguments used simultaneously, even when logically contradictory. Fear of intermarriage was thrown in, completely negating the idea they weren't interested in settling. It's impossible and probably pointless to try and separate the real arguments from the self-serving ones.
They all pointed to the same goals.
Two dominant goals: make the colonies, and later the Commonwealth, as British or white as possible, and eliminate cheap or unfair labor competition.
And this led to actual laws.
Oh yes. Riots and agitations, especially in Victoria and New South Wales in the 1850s and 60s, led directly to the first immigration restrictions, specifically targeting only Chinese people. Hong Kong, becoming a British port, made it easy for Cantonese speakers to get ships to the goldfields.
So the laws targeted the ships.
That was part of it. Victoria in 1855 and SW in 1861 introduced a limit 1 Chinese person per 10 tons of ship capacity, plus a 10-pound poll tax on arrival. Shipmasters were held responsible. South Australia and Queensland followed.
Not outright bans, but serious restrictions.
Designed to drastically cut numbers. They were actually repealed later in the 1860s when Chinese numbers fell on the goldfields, but the precedent was set. Chinese-only restrictions were now on the books, ready to be used again.
Federation, imperial pressure, and the invention of the educational test.
So after the initial gold rushes, things calmed down a bit, but then Chinese numbers started growing again. People moving into other jobs, building communities.
That's right. And at the same time, the colonies themselves were developing this stronger sense of identity, increasingly seeing themselves as definitely white, Christian, part of the British Empire, maybe even a superior version of Britain itself.
Ideas mixed up with race, religion, class.
All intertwined. And by 1881, this hardening vision of identity gets explicitly stated at an intercolonial conference. They declared, and I quote, "A strong feeling prevails in opposition to the unrestricted introduction of Chinese, arising principally from a desire to preserve and perpetuate the British type in the various populations."
Wow, preserve the British type. Pretty blunt.
Very blunt. Shows the deep anxieties about demographics and cultural identity, moving beyond just economics to this idea of, well, racial purity.
And following that, the restrictions got even tougher.
Much tougher. Across the colonies. In 1881, a new 10-pound poll tax and a 100-ton limit in NSW and Victoria. Then the tonnage limit jumped to 300 tons in 1888, even 500 tons in Queensland. And that 10-pound poll tax, it shot up to 100 pounds in 1888 or 50 pounds in Queensland, a massive amount back then.
Designed to be crippling.
Absolutely. Agreed upon by another conference of premiers, a united effort. And crucially, for the first time, Chinese people were mostly denied the right to become naturalized citizens. Tasmania was an exception.
Reinforcing that sojourner idea?
Exactly, implying they weren't really permanent residents. Tragically, it pushed many Chinese people into deeper debt, made them more vulnerable, which then justified more discrimination. A vicious cycle.
And you mentioned earlier this chicanery, people trying to get around the rules.
Oh, yes, the irony is rich. The restrictive laws spurred some ingenious workarounds. There was this loophole because Queensland had slightly different tonnage rules than New South Wales.
Okay.
So for years, ships would register extra Chinese passengers as crew in Queensland ports because Queensland's rules allowed fewer passengers than NSW. Once these crew passed Queensland customs legally, they'd be discharged when the ship reached NSW, bypassing the stricter passenger limits there.
Huh. That's clever.
When the new Prime Minister, Barton, found out, he was apparently furious, demanded it be rigorously dealt with. It just shows the level of deception involved in these policies, even before the dictation test proper.
Now, up to this point, it was mainly anti-Chinese laws. But then, late 19th century, there's a shift. A desire to restrict all non-white people.
A really significant shift, yes. Suddenly, this push to extend restrictions beyond Chinese people to all Asiatics or colored people. And the key thing is, it wasn't because there was a sudden new influx of these groups. There wasn't.
So why the change?
It was all about the approaching federation. Intense discussion about what kind of nation this new Australia would be, who belongs, who gets let in.
And the growing labor movement played a role.
A huge role. They were focused on getting and keeping higher wages for white workers. So Chinese and other non-white workers were mostly shut out of the increasingly powerful unions. Solidarity meant solidarity of white workers.
So white became the key term in the unions.
Became very common, very potent, defining who belonged. And for the middle-class politicians, passing restrictive immigration laws was a smart move. Politically kept the working-class voters happy while also shaping the explicitly white nation they wanted.
But it wasn't totally straightforward. Queensland and the Northern Territory were different.
Right, complicated by regional needs. Those areas, rich in resources, had actually allowed, even encouraged, Japanese, Pacific Islander, and Chinese labor for sugar plantations, mining, pearling.
Why?
The argument from local industries was that white workers just couldn't handle the harsh climate of the tropics. So colored labor was seen as a necessary evil. This economic argument was really the only significant opposition to the White Australia Project, a real tension between racial ideals and economic pragmatism.
But the overall fear shifted from just a Chinese influx to something broader.
Exactly. Even though the numbers were small, the fear became this generalized anxiety about an influx of colored peoples. Newspapers dramatized Japanese arrivals, painting them as formidable rivals to Europeans and Chinese.
Like that Northern Territory paper.
Yes, the Palmerston Times. It noted more Japanese arriving, causing considerable alarm. Said while Japanese were less objectionable, morally, than Chinese, industrially he is a much more formidable rival. Predicted a battle between Japanese and Chinese, but warned whoever comes out on top Australians will still be losers.
Grim prediction. Shows the anxiety broadening.
Definitely. Shifting threats, complex racial and economic competition fears, no longer just simple prejudice.
And this led to the Sydney Conference in 1896.
The culmination. Colonial premiers met and agreed on something momentous. Under the heading undesirable immigration, they unanimously agreed. That is desirable to extend without delay the provisions of the Chinese Restrictions Acts to all colored races.
Wow. No ambiguity there.
None at all. This was their direct attempt to create a white nation before federation was even finalized, solidifying their shared goal, laying the groundwork.
But London wasn't happy.
Not at all. This bold move ran straight into imperial disapproval. The acts passed by NSW, SAWA directly targeting colored races. They were all reserved by the governors.
Meaning London had to approve them.
Exactly. It required approval from the colonial secretary in London, a big hurdle. The British Empire wanted good relations with non-white powers like Japan, an important ally. And crucially, they wanted at least a facade of unity among all British subjects.
Including Indians?
Including the vast population of India. So London, via the colonial secretary, flatly said they couldn't advise the Queen to approve these reserved bills. Big diplomatic problem for the colonies. They needed a new approach.
So they needed a compromise. And Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 was the moment.
Perfect timing. A grand celebration of empire, perfect setting for an Imperial Conference in London. Premiers met Joseph Chamberlain, the powerful colonial secretary, to discuss alien immigration, the code word, really.
And Chamberlain had an idea.
He did. Aware of the colony's whiteness obsession, but also needing to smooth things over diplomatically, he proposed adopting the Natal legislation, an educational test.
The one from South Africa.
That's the one. He suggested, maybe a bit cynically, it would avoid stigmatizing them by name as unfit for civilized life. This test, writing 50 words in English dictated by an officer, had been used in Natal specifically to keep out Indian subjects without naming their race. Chamberlain suggested the Aussies use this model.
A way to exclude people without saying so.
Exactly. Exclude the undesirable class under a convenient veil of administrative neutrality, a path to their racial goals.
But not everyone jumped at it. George Reed from NSW wasn't keen.
Reed fought it initially. He wanted a direct approach, felt a colored flood was coming, and needed a clear barrier. He passionately declared, "We cannot veil the issue. We are sternly resolved that there shall be a white Australia."
He even challenged Chamberlain directly.
He did. Asked what happened if 10,000 Chinese arrived in Britain itself. "You know the convulsion that would create," he said, highlighting what he saw as British hypocrisy.
So Reed saw it purely as race.
Fundamentally race, not Chamberlain's diplomatic talk of pauper condition or ignorance. Reed thought letting people in just because they could scrape together enough English was trifling with the gravity of the subject. He found the test an evasion beneath our intention.
And the debate got nasty. Worse prejudice.
It did. Reed and Premier Braddon of Tasmania declared an Indian influx would be much worse than Chinese or Japanese. Reed called Indians the most undesirable, perhaps. Chamberlain just conceded they could exclude undesirable persons as long as it was done sensitively.
Chilling. The consensus was exclusion, just arguing about the method.
Precisely. So, despite some premiers initially wanting direct methods over these roundabout proposals, the need for a unified white Australia won. Exclusion of colored races was agreed. The debate shifted solely to the method.
And the natal test was the answer.
The perfect diplomatic fix. It allowed them to build that wall forever, as Reed wanted, achieving racial purity without overtly offending London or international allies.
The Bogus Quiz takes shape, colonial implementations and unheeded pleas.
Okay, so after that 1897 conference, the colonies started putting versions of the natal test into practice, laying the groundwork for the Commonwealth version.
Wasted no time. Western Australia was actually the first, and they made two key changes to the natal original, making it even tougher.
What were they?
First, you had to know English, not just any language of Europe. Second, you had to write 50 words dictated from a British author, not just fill out a form. Added another layer of cultural bias.
Were there exceptions?
A few. Property owners, people already living there, wives and children, and crucially, the pearl shell industry got an exemption. Shows some economic pragmatism mixed in with the racial intent.
But even then, people were worried about loopholes, like miners.
Yeah, miners' newspaper wanted the brown man kept out, but worried about the test. They worried about the native rising generation learning English and making the test useless. And they flagged the pearling exemption as a potential way for mining companies to get cheap labor.
And WA was pretty open about the purpose.
Incredibly brazen, actually. Unlike the later Commonwealth secrecy, WA's public regulations openly said the test was to be put into operation mainly to the exclusion of Asiatics and Africans.
Wow. No hiding it.
None at all. A public declaration of discriminatory intent, despite the supposed neutrality of an educational test, shows how confident or maybe desperate they were.
What about other colonies, NSW and Tasmania?
They stuck closer to the Natal original writing in some European language. Interestingly, in NSW, someone tried to amend the bill to specifically exclude Turkish as a European language.
Turkish?
Yeah, it failed, but it shows how political and arbitrary the definition of European was. Underscores the racial thinking behind it all.
And the test started being used in Sydney.
By early 1899, yes. Records show it denied entry to some Austrians and Syrians, but others, like Italians and more Austrians, passed. Suggests officials had a lot of discretion, applying it based on bias, not just literacy.
And shipping companies were expected to just understand.
Pretty much. Official reports said shipping companies needed to properly understand the law so it could work smoothly and simple, basically. A nod to the officials having lots of leeway. Tasmania's act also doubled up on existing Chinese rules, creating confusion that lasted into the Commonwealth era.
But not all colonies managed to get the test passed. Victoria failed.
Right. Victoria's attempt failed in Parliament. Critics raised obvious objections. The vagueness, the potential for caprice from customs officers. They use the famous example of Émile Zola, the great French novelist.
Who wouldn't pass an English dictation test?
Exactly, highlighting the absurdity. The bill's mover apparently declined to commit himself to an interpretation of his own bill. Shows the reluctance to even define the tool. South Australia's attempt failed too, critics calling it a move from simplicity to complexity and doubt. They rejected the intentional ambiguity.
What about New Zealand?
New Zealand, in 1899, was maybe a bit more careful. They added an appeal process to a magistrate if someone felt unfairly treated, perhaps more concerned with the appearance of fairness or just practicality.
But fundamentally, all these tests relied on the officials.
Absolutely. Relied on the discretion and prejudices of the officials.
Yeah.
And the fact they all used English or other European languages, with that whole Turkish debate showing how arbitrary European was beard, proved literacy wasn't the real point.
It was about proving Europeness.
An affinity with an undefined Europeness, a clear, though unstated, racial and cultural preference. That was the real gatekeeper.
So on the eve of Federation, despite all these efforts, Australia wasn't as white as the planners wanted.
Not at all. Indigenous peoples survived under immense pressure. Chinese people had settled, built communities, kept links with home, ensuring new arrivals. Small numbers of Indians, Pacific Islanders were present. Even Southern Europeans, like Italians, made some question what white even meant.
The stage was set for the new Commonwealth Parliament.
Exactly. Ready to introduce its first major law, the Immigration Restriction Act, designed to finally achieve that white Australia ideal.
The Commonwealth's absolute bar and the plea of Indian subjects.
So the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, not just any law, but the first substantive act of the new Commonwealth of Australia. Foundational stuff.
Absolutely foundational to the white Australia policy that would tragically define the nation for decades, shaped who could be Australian and maybe more importantly, who couldn't.
And the debate in the new parliament was fierce. Not about whether to have a white Australia policy, but how.
Exactly. The debate dragged on for months, August to December 1901. But the core goal, white Australia, was largely, chillingly accepted. The fight was all about the effectiveness and the discretion involved in the educational test.
And Prime Minister Barton thought it would work.
He declared it would be not only reasonably effective, but drastically effective. His focus was on achieving exclusion without naming races. That was the strategic intent behind the neutral language.
But the test changed quickly, didn't it? From something maybe passable to an absolute bar.
A rapid and crucial shift. It went from a test that, like Natal's, some might pass, to becoming, by June 1903, an absolute bar, a test virtually no one targeted was intended to pass, regardless of their actual education.
How did they do that in practice? What did the customs officers actually do? This is the gross chicanery you mentioned.
It was deliberate manipulation by the officers administering it. Initially, the law said 50 words in a European language. That left a loophole if someone was literate in a European language, even if they weren't considered desirable. So, to close that, officials started giving the test in different European languages, often obscure ones that the applicant was highly unlikely to know, even if fluent in English.
Like what?
Imagine a well-educated Chinese merchant, fluent in English, suddenly being asked to write a passage in, say, Scottish Gaelic, or Dutch, or Maltese. The choice of language was entirely up to the officer.
They could pick a language guaranteed to make someone fail.
Precisely. They quickly learned to use this power to ensure failure. By 1903, there was even a directive telling officers to select a language the immigrant would not understand. It became impossible for almost everyone deemed undesirable. Less about literacy, more like linguistic roulette with loaded dice.
And they could claim it was fair because it was just an educational test.
Exactly. Administrative sleight of hand. Claiming objectivity while practicing total, disguised racial exclusion.
And while Parliament was debating this, Joseph Chamberlain in London gets a letter from the Indian community in Victoria.
A really poignant, articulate letter, yes. October 1901. Penned by Walit Shah and 10 others. A powerful voice cutting through the colonial noise. They clearly understood the earlier tense debate between Chamberlain and the premiers.
Highlighting the hypocrisy.
Absolutely. Their plea for equality was direct, dignified. They asked Chamberlain that fundamental question, what is the difference between an Indian and any other member of the British nation?
Powerful.
They outline their history of loyalty, pride in British rule, willingness to give their blood, die for the empire, citing the Boer War, appealing directly to that shared imperial identity that was supposed to be colorblind.
And they were angry about being lumped in with the Chinese.
Deeply pained and indignant. They saw the Chinese through that imperial lens as a defeated and dying race after the Boxer Rebellion. And they couldn't understand why loyal British Indian subjects were targeted when Germans, Russians, French, Italians, foreigners, often from rival nations, weren't mentioned.
Do the members of Parliament consider the justice of this side of the question?
A pointed question. It was a cry for recognition, for respect, that just went completely unheard. A deep moral injury being inflicted.
And they use that family analogy.
A brilliant analogy. Really gets to the heart of the hypocrisy. They described a family. One brother, maybe not so handsome, tries hard to please his father, shows loyalty. But his other brothers, out of family jealousy, a clear jab at the Australian colonies, refuse him entry to their homes.
While still expecting to visit his home.
Exactly. Perfectly captured the injustice, the lack of reciprocal rights, the denial of family acceptance within the empire they belonged to, exposed the moral contradiction of white Australia and Britain's complicity.
And Chamberlain's response.
Tragically dismissive. The only reply seems to be this bland note attached when the letter was forwarded to the Australian Governor-General. Chamberlain, who'd weakly argued for Indian rights back in '97 and pushed the test as a solution, just asserted the legislation, quote, does not appear to cast any reflection upon any class of His Majesty's subjects.
Astonishing lack of shame.
A flat denial of sincere arguments. Clear imperial hypocrisy. Prioritizing political convenience over principle.
So, internal pressure from Indian subjects, but also external pressure from Japan.
Yes, Britain also had to manage external relations, especially with Japan. This heavily influenced the Dictation Test's design, particularly after the 1894 commercial treaty between Britain and Japan raised concerns about equal treatment for Japanese immigrants.
Japan was a rising power.
And Britain needed that alliance. Japan itself was incredibly sensitive about its international standing, its perceived level of civilization.
They already had deals with the U.S.?
Yes, to control emigration, showing they could self-regulate. They wanted similar respectful deals with Australia. Crucially, they were deeply offended at being put on the same level as the Chinese or other less advanced populations. This slur, Chamberlain noted, was keenly felt.
So outright racial exclusion of Japanese was impossible for Britain.
Diplomatically unfeasible, politically unacceptable. They needed an indirect method, like the Dictation Test, to exclude without causing an international crisis.
So is this incredibly complex balancing act?
Absolutely. Australia's fervent desire for a white Australia clashing with Britain's worries about internal subjects like Indians and external relations with powers like Japan.
And the educational test was the way out.
The ingenious, if cynical, compromise seemed non-discriminatory but achieved discriminatory ends, allowed Australia its white Australia policy without provoking imperial outrage or diplomatic incidents. A masterclass in political obfuscation. Outro.
So where does this leave us? We've gone through this remarkable and often pretty uncomfortable slice of Australian history. We've seen the Dictation Test wasn't just some simple exam.
Not at all.
It was this deeply complex legal and political tool, meticulously crafted, deliberately deployed, born from that whole mix of white settler anxiety, worries about labor and wages, and those big imperial pressures demanding diplomatic fixes. It let the new Australian nation enact a racially exclusive policy while pretending to be neutral on the world stage. A real masterclass in what Michael Williams' article rightly calls gross chicanery.
That evolution, too. From a test that was supposedly passable to that absolute bar that almost no one could pass, it just reveals this profound, troubling gap between what was said and what was actually done.
Yeah.
You have George Read's explicit arguments for a white Australia, and then you have that poignant, articulate letter from Malik Shah and the Indian community, pleading for basic dignity and equality within the empire.
And Chamberlain's response.
Standing in stark, heartbreaking contrast to Chamberlain's bland, dismissive diplomacy, this whole story just vividly highlights the deep moral compromises, the strategic use of ambiguity that went into forging the early Australian nation, shaped policies with long-lasting, often painful impacts that still anchor today, don't they, in discussions about identity, belonging, immigration.
They really do. The Dictation Test itself was finally abolished in 1958, after being used for decades as this tool of exclusion. But thinking about this history, it does raise a pretty important question, maybe a provocative one for you, the listener, to think about. In what subtle ways, perhaps non-stigmatizing ways on the surface, might society still craft policies today that end up achieving exclusionary aims, even when they look neutral or just administrative on the outside?
That's a heavy thought.
Something to ponder maybe as you navigate our complex world and its ongoing debates about, well, who belongs?
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for listening. As you can see, this brings us up just to the point at which the dictation test became established as a bogus test, a fake test, which was instrumental in declaring people as prohibited immigrants. And this lasted for a good 50 years. As I say, established in June 1903 in its final form, and fairly unchanged throughout the decades afterwards until the dictation test was finally abolished in 1958. And as I said, my dictation test book covers the administration of that and how that worked out, and how that mostly affected Chinese people of Chinese background, both Australian-born and non-Australian-born people of Chinese background, as well as Europeans on occasions, and causing some scandal at times. But that's for later podcasts that I'll bring into. At the moment, I just need you to know that if you have any questions, please write to chidestudypress@gmail.com. I'm happy to answer those. There are plenty more podcasts on various aspects of Chinese-Australian history to listen to, either on YouTube or on Podbean or podcast itself. And I hope that you've enjoyed listening to me, and in particular how friendly bots as they discuss articles written by myself. And on the details, you can get a hold of the article itself if you want to read it directly, or write to me and I'll send you a copy. Thank you very much for listening.